We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a gift from God. Great things often start with humble beginnings. McDonald's worldwide hamburger chain began with one little stand in San Bernardino. Apple computers started in a garage with a couple of young guys who had an idea. Tony Tan's Jollibee had its humble beginnings as an ice cream parlor which later grew into a global brand with 1,200 branches worldwide. Henry C. started out with a small sorry store business that helped them in their day-to-day life. He now holds $16.9 billion. It's often the same way spiritually. We have probably seen how God broke into the lives of faithful people. God's beginning with Jacob was like that. If you look at Jacob at the start, you can hardly imagine that here is the great father of the 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. He was a 77-year-old mama's boy, a cheat who had to flee for his life from his angry brother. And yet by his grace, God began to work in Jacob's life. There weren't quick changes, the process took a lifetime. But God's breaking into Jacob's life made the difference. We may need a new beginning with God in some areas. How can that take place? Genesis 28 shows us how. We start with verse 10 which says, Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. In obedience to his father's command to seek a wife, and also in compliance with his mother's counsel to evade the anger of Esau, Jacob set out on his journey toward Haran. Jacob embodies obedience to his parents in making the journey. This is a welcome change from the Jacob who had been a selfish trickster concerning his brother Esau's blessing and birthright. Isaac kept his word of blessing, but sent Jacob to travel alone in the wilderness with no servants, resources, or protection. Jacob now walks through the wilderness alone. His deceit leaves him confused about his purpose, in danger at home, and weary on his trip. Verse 11 says, when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. As Jacob traveled from Beersheba to Haran, he came to a place where he was obliged to stop because the sun had set and he is too tired to continue alone in the night. Jacob might have intended to reach Luz, but he opted to rest for the night. The stop was divinely appointed. The place where he stopped had already been consecrated by one of Abraham's altars. Jacob took some of the stones and made them his pillow. Hard headrests were common pillows in those days, rather than today's soft cushions. Verse 12 says, he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Jacob fell asleep and had a dream where he saw a ladder resting upon the earth, with the top reaching to heaven and upon it angels of God going up and down. The ladder was a visible symbol of the real and uninterrupted fellowship between God in heaven, and God's people on earth. As Jacob saw the ladder stretched from heaven to earth, God revealed to Jacob that he was available and accessible. The presence of the angels, God's messengers, served to support the notion that God wanted to communicate with Jacob. God showed a ladder of hope to a hopeless Jacob, who was caught up with a problem of his own making. God never ceases to seek relationship with humanity, and he continues to communicate with us in unexpected ways. Verse 13 says, there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. The vision was not just about angels. The Lord stood above the ladder. This is a personal revelation of Jehovah to Jacob. In proclaiming himself to Jacob as the God of his fathers, God not only confirmed to him all the promises made to Abraham and the blessing for which Isaac prayed in their fullest extent, but God also assured Jacob of protection on his dangerous journey and a safe return to his home. God revealed himself as God who keeps promises through generations. He reinforces the promise of this land that will continue to be central throughout the Old Testament. Verse 14 says, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Jacob left home with a heavy heart. Through this dream, God reiterated his promises to Abraham and Isaac, relayed to Jacob the prosperity of his descendants, and reassured him of his presence during this dangerous journey. The promise to make Jacob's children as the dust of the earth is a direct quote from a previous promise to Abraham. God clearly uses the simile to emphasize the multitude of descendants. There is no place on earth where there is no dust. Similarly, there will be no place on earth where Jacob's descendants are not found. God seems to include a sense of ubiquity of influence, too. The spiritual legacy of Israel will reach every corner of the earth. All the families of earth shall be blessed is the promise of the Messiah to come through his direct seed line, who will provide to all the earth the access to the Father, that the ladder of the vision represents. Verse 15 says, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. God showed him the communication that exists between heaven and earth, the guard of angels and his ever-watchful eye looking down on him, whether awake or asleep. God confirmed Jacob's destiny as the heir of God's promise to his forefathers and to the world. Jacob then has nothing to fear. No evil would happen to him while God was his guardian and strong defense. The Lord, in this dream, completely dispelled Jacob's fears by confirming the covenant and promises he had made to Abraham and renewed with Isaac. Verse 16 says, When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. When Jacob wakes from the dream, he knows God had made this place his peculiar residence. In that moment Jacob realized that God had been with him even when he did not know it. Jacob had fallen asleep fearful, helpless, alone, sorrowful, and anxious, without any thought that he was especially cared for or watched by Abraham's God. He thought he had been exiled from the presence of the Lord because he had cooperated in deceiving his brother Esau. Instead, God offered him promise, not condemnation. The Lord gave Jacob the promise of future generations and of God's continued presence with them. Verse 17 says, He was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, this is the gate of heaven. As Jacob awakes, a feeling of awe came upon him. The dream had, no doubt, left an impression so strong that Jacob declared, How dreadful is this place, which means both to be afraid and to stand in awe or godly fear. It describes things, whether good or bad, that make you stop and consider them. As Jacob continued on his journey, he was to carry with him a holy awe of the gracious presence of God. The appearance of the ladder, the Lord standing at its top, and the movement of the angels left Jacob with a true sense of God's commitment to keep his covenant with Jacob's forefathers. He voices how special this place is. It is the house of God, gate of heaven, the divine abode. Verse 18 says, Early the next morning Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. Consequently, when he arose, he solemnly dedicated one of the stones and vowed to follow God himself and bring his tithes to the God who dwelt in this place. The next morning Jacob turned the pillow into a pillar. He erected the stones upon which he had laid his head as a monument of the extraordinary vision he had in this place. The pillow stones served to mark the place of his restoration. Jacob's experience moved him to worship and praise the Lord. He poured oil upon the top to consecrate it as a memorial of the mercy that had been shown him there. Verse 19 says, He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Jacob named the place Bethel, house of God, the town had been called Luz. It appears that Jacob gave the name not to the place where the pillar was set up, but to the town in the surrounding neighborhood where he had received this divine revelation. He would renew this name on his return from Mesopotamia. The renaming of the place gives significance of this moment for Jacob. Every time he would pass by Bethel again, he would remember that he met God there. Verse 20 says, Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear. Jacob made a vow. This was no ordinary vow, but a grand and solemn expression of Jacob's complete acceptance of the Lord to be his God. Typically, in the Old Testament, vows were made in situations of distress. Jacob's vow was no exception. He was in a distressed state. He was running away from home and the threat of death. But now he has received an unexpected revelation announcing his return to his country and guaranteeing him safety on the journey. Here God showed Jacob the future and confirmed to him the covenant promise. Verse 21 says, "So that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God." God had already made an unconditional promise to Jacob to watch over him and bring him back to this land. Jacob did not need to do anything in return, but still, he offered to God an altar, a tithe, and a commitment. One thing is certainly clear from this episode: Jacob was gradually changing his ways. Instead of relying on his abilities, he was to stop being the trickster, as his name implies, and to rely on God to supply his needs and protect him. Yet Jacob seems to establish some conditions for this relationship. The if in Jacob's vow is the progression of Jacob taking word: if God is going to do so much for me, then I will do something for him. Jacob's character as a bargainer did not change instantly, as he sought to know God's character as sovereign and faithful. Verse 22 says, "And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me I will give you a tenth." In other words, if God were willing to fulfill his covenant promise, then Jacob would acknowledge and worship him as his God, both by building an altar and tithing all his possessions. Jacob did not yet know that God was sovereign and ever faithful, but we can have faith in God's character and do not need to bargain with him for what he has already promised. Key verse: "I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Genesis 28:15. This is God's promise to every person of every age and generation. We are called to continue and participate in the spiritual legacy begun through our spiritual fathers before us. That continues to this day, but in the process personally called to individual faith and fellowship in Him. That is why God's promise of protection and provision to Jacob also applies to us. Let us hold fast to these lessons from Genesis 28 on how God restores His people. 1. God begins at our point of need, verse 19. In problem solving, the first step is to recognize and define the problem. Often our problem is that we don't clearly see the problem. We aren't aware of our great need, so we aren't open for God to move into our lives to begin working on the problems. Many times it takes a crisis for us to be able to see our need and be open to God's breaking into our lives. 2. God begins with His grace, verses 10 to 15. At Jacob's point of need, God gave him a strange dream. Jacob understood this dream as God breaking into his life. Jacob had not personally encountered God until this point. God was concerned about him in his place of desperate need, and there was a bridge of access to God to seek His help and from God to receive His help. That's how Jacob must have understood the symbolism of this dream. 3. When God begins, we should respond to Him, verses 16 to 22. Jacob did not know what to do. He babbles on about the place being awesome, the house of God, the gate of heaven. Jacob responded to the Lord as best he knew how. While Jacob's response was immature at best, at least it was a response, and God met him there. 4. True spirituality is not our climbing our way to God, but God opening the heavens and making Himself visible to us. It is God who is most interested to build a relationship with Him. All we need to do is realize our need for His grace. 5. An experience with God doesn't provide instant spirituality and maturity. It merely begins the process. Our transformation involves the gradual adjustments and changes to our perception of how we worship Him and live our lives. Thought to remember. Remember God's faithfulness to you in tangible ways. Our praise, worship, and acts of thanksgiving are not private matters, they ought to be demonstrated daily. God's presence in our lives has to be perceivable through the way we live. If they see us do good works for God, they will know how to build their altars. If they see us recognize and worship God, even after mistakes, setbacks, and wilderness experiences, they will know God can meet them in their wilderness, as well. Our lesson next week is entitled, God's Blessing. Our biblical reference is Genesis 30:22-32, 43. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this week's lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. We wish you can join us at the Cubao Church of Christ soon. Our congregation is a place to discover faith, find new friends, grow closer relationship with Christ and serve with each other's gifts. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.